you're calling us from Canada, if I remember correctly, and as previously Kim said, that you're a trauma-informed lawyer, and there's plenty to be said on that topic. Like, what is the trauma? What does it mean to be a vicarious trauma or trauma-informed lawyer? That is definitely a topic that we don't really hear much when we go into the law school and even when we practice the law. It's something that perhaps emerged in the last couple of years or last decade. But please, the stage is all yours, and introduce yourself to this group, to these lovely people on the call. And do tell me if you have the presentation.
Yep. Okay. Good morning. Or I don't know what time it is for all. It's morning here. I'm in Vancouver on the West Coast. Hi, Kim. Kim and I know each other. Yeah, I did send like a quick slide deck. It really is not much, but it just lays out a colleague's article on trauma-informed lawyering that I really wanted to amplify for folks who are interested in trauma-informed law. I think it's a really great resource to take a look at. And so I don't know, like, am I able to share my screen, or I sent it to, I can't remember who I sent it to. Okay. Oh, there it is. Okay, so I simply, if we could just go to the next slide, I simply shared this or created this small little 3-slide PowerPoint because I wanted to share Sarah Katz and Dia Halder's article, The Pedagogy of Trauma-Informed Lawyering, with all of you. So I just want to say, like the two of them set out the hallmarks of trauma-informed legal practice there really well. And for folks who are interested, it's a really good resource to start to get an understanding of what trauma-informed law is. But just a little bit about me. I'm a lawyer on the West Coast. I'm Indigenous, what some people more commonly call in the United States and elsewhere Native American. You know, I had a lot of trauma in my background growing up, and when I went to law school, I found the law school experience to be quite traumatizing, and I knew I was going to be working with my own people, Indigenous people, where there was a lot of trauma, and most recently as folks who know anything about what's going on in Canada, a lot of genocide attempts at our people, which from what I understand was modeled after the apartheid system in South Africa. They put us in schools, they tried to kill our language, our culture, all of these things. And so what happens when you treat a people in this way? You get a lot of trauma, you get a lot of addictions, you get a lot of self-harm, all kinds of things. And so I really wasn't prepared to advocate for or work with people who had such complex traumas. I didn't have a background in psychology, and I never heard about trauma in law school. And I just, having to work with people on a daily basis, either as defense counsel, later as a Crown prosecutor, and then later as an adjudicator, who had all of these traumas, like the whole range of human suffering coming to my door. I was not equipped to deal with it. And so I had to learn a better way, but there was nowhere to go. There was nothing I could read, no mentor to teach me, nothing I could look back on my law school experience to help inform. And I really just had to become quite intuitive and think about the teachings of my great-grandmother and forge a new way forward, sort of on my own. And it was only later when I started to think about trauma and trauma-informed approaches to legal practice that I found Sarah Katz and Dia Halder's work. There's not a lot out there, but it was a really great starting point. And really what trauma-informed legal practice, trauma-informed lawyering requires is that we as lawyers ought to be trained to identify trauma in all of its complex ways, and that we should be able to adjust the lawyer-client relationship to accommodate trauma. And then from there, adapt our litigation strategy to avoid re-traumatizing people, because really, like, at the base of, or the foundation of this practice is to do no further harm to people. That really is the objective. And at the same time, prevent vicarious trauma. So what does that mean? That we also do no further harm to ourselves. So trauma-informed lawyering or approaches to legal practice is not just for the benefit of clients, it's also for the benefit of your colleagues, and it's for the benefit of yourself. So for those of you who practice in an area where there is a ton of trauma, whether, you know, like what comes to mind for me in terms of clients experiencing trauma is, of course, criminal law, family law, immigration, refugee, human rights. Like that's just barely scratching the surface. But I say anybody who has a commitment to solicitor-client relationships or client satisfaction or client engagement, trauma-informed lawyering and training in that and understanding of it really is for you, because it's going to improve so many things, beginning with, I would say, the courageous work of really looking to see whether the way you engage with people is driven by your ego or is it driven by empathy. How do you show up when you engage with people? Is it what is your relationship to time and control over a process? How relational are you in delivering legal services? Are you relational? Are you transactional? What is the difference? And really, what are the risks in terms of traumatizing or triggering your client and others? So it really, and what are your biases and your beliefs, and what are your own personal traumas that might inform the way you engage with people and the way you show up in court systems and other places. So really, trauma-informed lawyering calls on you to really look within and think about how you create barriers, and whether you create or practice healthy boundaries when you engage with clients and others. And I would say, and I know lawyers typically don't like this, but I would say that this this approach to lawyering really calls on you to be vulnerable and to have a lot of courage as you engage with people. And I know lawyers also don't like vulnerability either, but I think it's a necessary thing, because if we're so disconnected that we have zero self-awareness about how we show up and the harm that we do, then our legal systems are going to continue to create harm, and as a result are going to lose credibility with the people who really need to access these services, either for justice or for protection or for you know, whatever their needs are. I mean, I don't know how it is all over the world, but I know here in Canada, our criminal court system has zero credibility for survivors of intimate partner violence, gender-based violence, and sexual violence. None of those people who really need support and protection and justice, and I use air quotes, will show up into those processes because they know it is more likely than not that they will be traumatized and sort of raked over the coals before they get out of the process. And they likely won't walk away with the outcome that they are seeking. And so this trauma-informed lawyering approach really also extends to courts. Like, how do we become trauma-informed courtrooms? How do we become trauma-informed judges? There's a lot of information education that really needs to be shared amongst lawyers and judges all over the world to really think about how their systems and their processes need to evolve and innovate to inspire confidence in people who really need support. And so this is a valuable resource. This approach to the practice is a valuable resource for all lawyers. And then I wanted to say, with respect to vicarious trauma, which I think is really important, I know here in Canada, every time a report comes out on like the mental health of the legal profession, it is never good. Like, we have high addiction rates, we have high suicide rates. I'm sure in many other parts of the world, there are also, you see folks, lawyers who show up and and where like alcoholism has become normalized, or dealing with graphic content has become normalized, and we don't think about who we're exposing to this information in the execution of our duties, whether it's support staff or the courts or court staff or whoever it may be. And so what happens when we engage in this way? We do a lot of harm to others that are part of the system, but maybe don't really have a voice to say anything about changing the system. And we do a lot of harm to ourselves because we're not reflecting on how the content that we are exposing ourselves to is impacting our mental health. We're not thinking about how the content that we expose others to are impacting their mental health. And it all really just feeds these disastrous outcomes. And so I don't know, like I know here in Canada, at least in Ontario, there has been one justice who has published two sentencing decisions, reasons for a sentence. And in both of those, these two specific sentences involved child pornography. And he really is calling on the legal profession to publish materials that address vicarious trauma in the courtroom, because he's also calling on politicians and lawmakers to look at legal reform to change rules of evidence to allow for graphic and disturbing materials to be submitted to the court in a way that doesn't expose everybody to imagery, sounds that might stay with them for a long time, and maybe at the end of the day compel them to actually leave the profession or leave their jobs, because it's disturbing. And I think when people sign up for certain work, we don't all necessarily sign up with the agreement that we want to be traumatized. Like, we don't go into law saying, yes, just traumatize me. So vicarious trauma is really important to be thinking about it, to be talking about it, and then from there really building a resilient strategy. We could do this individually, we could do it collectively within our bar associations, and of course we could do it as an organization within our law firms. So how do we build a resilient strategy? It takes conversation, it takes inviting in mental health professionals to look at how do we support lawyers and judges as we go through these processes that might be exposing us to a lot of graphic information, especially on the regular. And I'm not talking about your very basic employee mental health programs that you sort of get as a benefit when you become employed somewhere. I'm not talking about some 1-800, lawyers counseling program that you can access. I'm talking about employers actually taking the responsibility of ensuring the mental health of their people so that they can continue to move forward in a good way and be able to talk with someone if they are experiencing a number of challenges as a result of the content in their cases. And I really think that obligation or that duty is something that employers need to be thinking about, especially if they want to ensure that their workplace is a positive workplace that inspires long-term retention and the well-being of all of their people. And so trauma-informed legal practice really is a starting place to ultimately transform this entire profession and make it holistic, make it more empathetic, and challenge us to look at why we engage in adversarial ways, and do we need to actually engage? Do we need to actually be as adversarial as we are? How can we minimize risking the mental health of other people that we work with who maybe didn't sign up for that? How do we become alive to our red flags, like in terms of what our weaknesses are, or our own personal vulnerabilities to ensure that we protect ourselves as we go through the difficult process of executing our duties. And how do we both informally and formally find support strategies for ourselves and each other. There's just so many benefits, and ultimately it's not just the clients who win, it's not just the witnesses, it's not just the public who observed these new ways of achieving justice and executing the law, but we benefit profoundly. And so that essentially is like the basis of what trauma-informed lawyering is and what a trauma-informed approach to practice is. And at least here in Canada, we're talking a lot about recognizing this as an ethical competency. Like, this is a competency that lawyers have to learn. I know more and more law schools are looking at how they could build this into their curriculum so that law students have an understanding of trauma-informed lawyering before they even go to do the bar course. I know law societies are looking at how they might be implementing and reflecting trauma-informed lawyering at the bar course before these folks get licensed. And so, yeah, I think right now we live in a really unique time where we can create positive transformational outcomes for our profession, and trauma-informed legal practice really is like a starting point for that. Yeah, and just to comment on Kim's note, like, first we need to admit that trauma is an issue. Yeah, I mean, first we do need to admit that, and I'm fortunate in that through my podcast, The Trauma-Informed Lawyer, the feedback I get from members of the legal profession and the judiciary, and particularly law students, are recognizing that trauma is indeed an issue in the legal profession. And I really love that so many law students follow this podcast, because they're hearing these stories, and they're hearing all this lived experience of all these wonderful folks from Canada and beyond, and they are then going to their deans demanding that they get an education in trauma-informed lawyering. They're demanding it. So at least 2 law schools that I'm aware of here in Canada, as a result of the podcast and the law student demands, are now looking at how they can create curriculum and where to include it within legal ethics course or otherwise. So change is coming, and I think the whole world needs to hop on this bandwagon. Okay, so I think that's my like 15-minute intro. If anyone has any questions, I'm open to answering if I have the answers. And I know that the link to my podcast has just been posted. I hope you take a listen. And yeah, so I think the presentation I'm doing tomorrow is really going into some of the like a deeper dive into these concepts, these hallmarks of trauma-informed lawyering.
Maybe I'll give a little plug. There's also the ABA is going to publish a book, and Myrna is one of the authors. So the American Bar Association is doing trauma-informed law, a primer for law practice. And so that won't be out until next year, because books have that kind of a slow appearance, but it is becoming a topic that's being given some attention.
Yeah, definitely. I'm looking forward to actually seeing that book come to like become this tangible document. And here in Canada, we just completed a project called the Trauma-Informed Legal Practice Toolkit. It was funded by the British Columbia Law Foundation, and that thing has just been finalized, and we're going to start distributing it all over the place next week. And in the coming, I think, month or two, we're going to create an online version of it and a downloadable PDF. And so people from, you know, all across the globe will be able to access it, especially those who are thinking about, you know, like questioning what is this and how might it help the way I engage in the practice of law, or the way my firm or my bar association does what it does. It's definitely going to be a very helpful educational resource for folks.
Hey, Myrna. Thank you so much for the presentation. I was in another session, so I didn't catch most of your presentations. If I'm asking something that you already dealt with, sorry. But one of the things, I mean, I really appreciate this trauma-informed approach to legal practice and lawyers becoming more present and understanding the impact of the work on them. I wanted to understand a little more about how this approach could possibly be applied even outside of just legal practice and how lawyers engage in legal practice, but to be more aware of the trauma that we carry in our bodies and how that informs how we respond to conflict situations. Do you have?
Yeah. So, I mean, the last piece of that slide deck addresses, it says like the 4 hallmarks of trauma-informed, lawyering. The fourth one is vicarious trauma and preventing vicarious trauma. So earlier I spoke just quickly to how if we have personal traumas in our lives, like we can become at risk for then carrying the traumas of the people that we work with, or then carrying the traumas of stories and images that we are exposed to. And I think it's something that we really need to be alive to, particularly if we work in a high conflict area that subjects us to a lot of disturbing information and evidence on a regular basis. I mean, I'm no psychotherapist, but what I can tell in terms of my own personal experience, witnessing my colleagues and how they're responding to graphic evidence on a regular basis, and the little bit of research I've done, is that if you have personal unresolved traumas, your risk increases for vicarious trauma. If you work in an organization that doesn't acknowledge vicarious trauma, that also increases your risk. And then if you're repeatedly exposed to disturbing information and evidence, then that really amplifies your risk. In addition to, I would say, also being really empathetic. If you're just a naturally empathetic person, it's easy to want to it's just natural, I think, to just feel what your client is feeling or what a witness is feeling, and carry that home with you. And so trauma-informed lawyering with respect to vicarious trauma will really provide lawyers with the tools and the information they need to think about where their vulnerabilities lie and what it is that needs to be addressed, and also flag for them what their triggers are, because I think sometimes we get so busy we don't really check in terms of how we're feeling and when we're being triggered. So triggers can be all kinds of things. It can include nightmares or agitation or anxiety. And so vicarious trauma, thanks Sandra for that. So vicarious trauma really is, I would say, it's a preoccupation with the lived experience or with the evidence or information of somebody else that we've been helping through a process. Some people call it secondary trauma. Some people call it compassion fatigue. I don't really like compassion fatigue because that presupposes we have compassion. And in this profession, I don't think that that's always true. But it's very different from burnout. Burnout is like you've been working too hard, you need a couple weeks off, and then, you rebuild and replenish your resources, you come back and you're good to continue pushing through it. But vicarious trauma is really like a negative preoccupation that really results in all kinds of psychological issues. So where you can't shake something, you can't forget something, you can't unsee something, you can't unhear something. It creates results in nightmares. You have a hard time sleeping, you start drinking more, you start taking drugs, you start to maybe live in ways that are making decisions that don't necessarily align with your values, and you don't really know why, or you don't feel passionate about anything. You sort of feel a sense of a loss of purpose or a loss of passion, or absenteeism, or you have a hard time focusing. There's just a whole range of negative effects that can happen. And some of them are so subtle, they could begin simply with insomnia, or all of a sudden out of nowhere, you're feeling really panicky and you don't know why. And so I think it's so important for people to understand what it is and be able, like, be trained to identify it when it comes up for them, and know exactly who they can go to and what they need to do to address it. But more importantly, I think prevention strategies are critical, and that's where employers can come in and support that. So how do we do that? One episode I have in my podcast about sustainable law practice with Helgi Mackey, she talks a lot about debriefing, like how law firms should really build into their work week and within their organization a debriefing debriefing practices, and have that be acceptable and have that be something that they promote. Debriefing can really help people just kind of put that stuff down so they don't take it home and it doesn't have a negative effect on them. And debriefing is really different from distraction. Like, distraction is going to talk to your friend about the movie you saw or what's on Netflix, or, hey, do you want to go to Starbucks? And while we're walking to Starbucks, let's talk about, you know, things that don't matter. That's really distraction. Debriefing is where you come to a colleague or someone else and you say, I just heard this, or I just saw this, or I just experienced this, and like it feels like this, and I just needed to say something, acknowledge it so I could let it go, so it doesn't go home with me. And that's not about talking about what's on Netflix or your Starbucks order. That's very intentional, and it's really important. Like, I think it's so critical. As somebody who was highly impacted for years examining people who experienced horrific childhood sexual abuse by priests and nuns in these residential schools here in Canada, eventually I had to take a year off of work, and I went into intensive therapy like 3 to 4 times a week for about 4 months. That was the kind of dark place I was in, and it was really because nobody gave me a heads up about the psychological toll this work was going to take on me. And so but had somebody said, hey, vicarious trauma, you need to do this, create like a self-care plan, get a therapist, have some practices in place where you can put the stuff down and you don't carry it. I may have stayed in that process much longer. I may have built adaptive strategies to really increase my resilience. And, you know, I may have not had to take a year off work to focus solely on my mental health. And since creating this podcast and talking to a number of lawyers, I've heard many people say similar things, that they've had to leave the practice for a time to take care of themselves and then come back because, you know, for them, their work resulted in addictions or illness or whatever it was. And for others, they left the practice of law and they just never came back. And I don't think the work that we start doing because we love it so much should be the thing that really does us harm. And so understanding vicarious trauma and becoming trauma informed yourself will really empower you to build your own adaptive strategies, become more resilient, and protect yourself and your mental health, safeguard your mental health as you go through this profession, so that when your day comes to retire, you feel as strong as you did the day that you started in this profession. That's my pitch for vicarious trauma.
And I would say, you know, for those lawyers who don't take care of themselves and figure out how to, you know, be present and understand their triggers and deal with this, you can go the other way, which I think for a while I did, where you develop the strategies to separate yourself from it. And you detach from it, and you have a whole narrative of that detachment. And what that does is then you have a person walking around in society with that detachment, who has the capability to do the detachment. And so, yeah, I feel that we do have a problem in the legal profession, because in order to be so-called successful or effective, I should say, in court, you have to develop these kinds of tools to detach yourself from the emotional connection to some of the things that you're dealing with, but then that's something that becomes a part of you going forward. So it is trauma begetting more trauma that then you go through instilling that on others. So I really think, really grateful for your contribution here today, and bringing, you know, greater awareness to this issue into the legal profession. I think it's so important. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me in.
Yeah. So I see it's around 7:29. Anya?
I mean, what you were just describing, yeah, it brings me back to my law school. We had a professor for criminal law, and he was literally like a robot. You could see that he, made a wall around himself, and he was providing us with a case about rape, and it literally sounded as if he's providing us with a recipe for pancakes. So all of us students who came into that class, we were shocked. We were just like, really, this is who we are becoming? It was, a bit of a resentment towards criminal law cases and the criminal subject. I love the case though. I mean, not the case, but the whole subject area. It's been a huge interest of mine, but the fact that how it ruined the humanity of that man, it really sticked with me. And now knowing that there's people like yourself addressing trauma, knowing also that, on the Balkan, we were speaking about that numerous times because of the racism that is happening now. And we have plenty of talks, just what it is that, for example, we can do in here. And basically people cannot even raise the issue of racism because people are still having open wounds because of the genocides that was happening like 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And knowing that there is lots of trauma that has been not addressed properly, possibly not even slightly, it's very welcoming to have these discussions and recordings of them so that we can have the replays even afterwards and reshare that. Thank you for being part of that.
And we look forward to your session tomorrow, where you will share some of these frameworks and all of that. And I wasn't here for most of your sessions. I don't know if you spoke about your own journey and walk to this work. So I look forward to, hearing and learning more about
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I'm looking forward to it.
Okay.
Thank you. And thanks, Kim, for hanging around and listening to me.
My pleasure.